Welcome to Beyond Reasonable Doubt, the home of true crime stories from every corner of the globe. From forgotten killers in the shadows of history to the cases gripping headlines today, we bring you chilling accounts of crime, mystery, and the dark side of human nature. Please consider subscribing to my channel, hit like, share, and turn on the notification bell as well as comment down below. Thank you. In the rolling hills of present-day Slovakia stand the ruins of a fortress, a place where history and horror intertwine. It is here, in the shadow of Countess castle, that whispers of blood and cruelty have echoed for more than 4 centuries. And at the center of those whispers is a name, Elizabeth Bathory. To some, she was a refined noblewoman, educated and powerful beyond her time. To others, she was the most prolific female killer in history, the Blood Countess, who bathed in the lifeblood of her victims. But where does the truth lie? Between the yellowed pages of court records and the darker corners of folklore, the story of Elizabeth Bathory is as elusive as it is disturbing. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Hungary. Her bloodline was a tapestry of wealth, politics, and privilege, but also inbreeding, a common practice among nobility to preserve titles and estates. She grew up amid a volatile landscape where Ottoman invasions threatened the Hungarian kingdom and political alliances shifted like sand. From birth, Elizabeth was surrounded by the language of power. She was fluent in multiple languages, literate in Latin, and educated in the management of estates. But in her formative years, she also would have witnessed a kind of cruelty that was normalized in her society: public executions, torture of enemies, and corporal punishment for disobedience. Her family's influence was vast. Among her relatives were high-ranking church officials, military commanders, and even royalty. But privilege came with a shadow, one that would follow Elizabeth throughout her life. At the age of 10, Elizabeth was betrothed to Countess, the son of another powerful noble family. It was a political alliance, a union that would merge wealth, land, and military might. The marriage would be formalized when Elizabeth turned 15. These marriages were not about love. They were about power. For Elizabeth, marrying Ferenc meant stepping into a role that would place her at the heart of one of the most influential estates in the kingdom. In 1575, the marriage was celebrated with grandeur, and Elizabeth moved into Countess castle. The fortress, with its high walls and strategic location, would become her domain and, centuries later, the center of her legend. Ferenc was a soldier, a man of the battlefield. His loyalty to the crown meant he was often away, leading campaigns against the Ottomans. In his absence, Elizabeth assumed full control over their estates, overseeing finances, agricultural production, and the management of servants. This was not unusual for noblewomen of the time, but Elizabeth excelled at it. She was authoritative, decisive, and by all accounts, she demanded absolute obedience. It was during these early years at Countess that whispers of cruelty began. Accounts, some from later depositions, describe punishments that went beyond the norms of the time: beatings, starvation, exposure to the elements. In an era where discipline was harsh, the line between strict and sadistic was already blurred. The accusations suggest Elizabeth crossed it frequently, but without Ferenc's moderating presence, if he ever did temper her, her power within the walls was unchecked. Ferenc returned from war carrying both victories and the brutality of the battlefield. Some historians suggest he may have even shared violent practices with Elizabeth, teaching her methods of torture used on prisoners. It's difficult to separate fact from speculation, but we do know that in their time, inflicting pain on enemies was considered a legitimate display of authority. Their marriage produced several children, heirs, who would ensure the continuation of the family's legacy. Yet behind closed doors, darker habits may have been taking root. For years, Countess remained a central figure in Hungary's fight against the Ottoman Empire. He became known as the Black Knight of Hungary, feared by enemies for his ruthless efficiency. but his absence from Countess meant that Elizabeth's authority over the castle, its lands, and its people grew stronger with each passing season. Elizabeth was not a passive noblewoman waiting for her husband to return. She governed, she held court over disputes, she managed the economy of her estates, and she did so with a precision and command that impressed and intimidated those around her. By the early 1600s, the constant strain of war and illness began to erode Ferenc's health. Some accounts speak of lingering pain from battle wounds. Others suggest a debilitating disease. Whatever the cause, his condition worsened rapidly. In 1604, Ferenc Nadezhdy died. Elizabeth was 44 years old, and now the undisputed head of her household, her lands, and her fortune. With Ferenc gone, any potential check on Elizabeth's authority disappeared. The widow now held complete control, not only of her own estates, but also the fates of those who lived and worked within her walls. This was an extraordinary concentration of power for a woman in the early 17th century. She answered to almost no one except the king, and even then, only in matters that touched royal interest. At first, the stories were quiet. Servant girls who went to the castle for work and never returned. Families whispered, but few dared to accuse a countess of wrongdoing. In rural Hungary, peasants were at the mercy of their lords. If a young girl disappeared after entering service at a noble's household, it was easy for that loss to vanish into silence, especially when fear kept tongues still. The depositions taken years later describe acts of chilling brutality, beatings that left bodies broken, needles driven beneath fingernails, exposure to freezing cold until the victim's skin turned blue. Some of the most lurid accusations claimed she drained the blood of her victims to preserve her youth. Whether this was fact, rumor, or deliberate slander, it became the foundation of the legend that would endure. There is no contemporary evidence of bathing in blood. That detail appears decades later, likely as part of a political effort to demonize her further. But in the popular imagination, it stuck and it still defines her image today. Elizabeth's need for new servants became insatiable. Witnesses later claimed she would lure girls with promises of fine clothes, wages, and the protection of noble service. But for many, the journey to Countess was a one-way trip. Some victims were drawn from noble families, a dangerous move that would later seal her fate. By 1609, the disappearances had become impossible to ignore. Reports reached King Matthias II, not only from peasants, but from noble families whose daughters had vanished. Political rivalries, debts, and personal grudges added fuel to the fire. Elizabeth owed a significant sum to the king. This financial tension may have motivated the crown to move against her, especially if they could seize her lands in the process. In late 1610, King Matthias II appointed Count Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, to investigate the rumors surrounding Elizabeth Bathory. Thurzo had both the king's trust and the authority to act in his name. Count Thurzo was not a neutral party. He was related to Elizabeth through marriage, and his position meant he had to navigate both political and family considerations. But the king's orders were clear: uncover the truth and, if necessary, put an end to it. Count Thurzo began quietly questioning villagers, servants, and former employees of the Bathory household. What he heard was a chorus of fear and horror. Dozens of witnesses described the same patterns: young women summoned to the castle, screams in the night, and bodies buried in secret. The consistency of these accounts is striking. They describe similar injuries, similar methods, and similar timelines. For an investigator, this was a red flag that pointed to something systematic, not isolated accidents. Under interrogation, Elizabeth's most trusted servants broke. Dorothea Shentz, Alona Jo, Janos Ujvari, all confessed to aiding their mistress in acts of cruelty and murder. Whether these confessions were given freely or under torture, They painted a damning picture. They spoke of victims beaten with rods until flesh tore, burned with hot irons, or left to freeze in the courtyard. Some were said to have died within hours, others after days of torment. These testimonies are a double-edged sword. On one hand, they are the backbone of the case. On the other, their reliability is questionable, given the interrogation methods of the time. But to the authorities, they were more than enough. On December 30th, 1610, Count Thurzo struck. With a band of soldiers, he entered the castle to catch Elizabeth in the act. Accounts from the raid describe the discovery of 2 dead girls, and one clinging to life. It was, to Count Thurzo, undeniable proof. Thurzo confronted the Countess directly, reading aloud the accusations in the presence of witnesses. Elizabeth denied nothing, but neither did she confess. Elizabeth's demeanor that night is one of the most debated aspects of her story. Some portray her as defiant, others as resigned, but there is no question she understood the gravity of the moment. In a move that surprised many, Elizabeth was not taken to Budapest for trial. Instead, Thurzo confined her within her own castle, placing her under a kind of noble house arrest. Her accomplices, however, were not spared. Their trial would be public, their punishment swift and brutal. On January 2nd, 1611, the trial of Elizabeth Bathory's accomplices began. Dorothea Szents, Ilona Joe, and Janos Ujvary faced the charges of abduction, torture, and murder. The court summoned dozens of witnesses, including relatives of the missing. The depositions were harrowing. Parents spoke of daughters who left for work at the castle, never to be seen again. Survivors described punishments so cruel they defied imagination. In the court's eyes, the servants were beyond redemption, even though their actions were under the orders of a noblewoman. The sheer number of deaths demanded the harshest possible sentence. The verdict was swift. Dorothea Szents and Ilona Joe were sentenced to have their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Janos Ujvary was beheaded, his body burned afterward. The executions were carried out the very next day. The court had made its point. Justice, in their eyes, had begun. And yet, Elizabeth herself was never brought before the court. The reasons remain a matter of debate. Some say her noble status protected her from public humiliation. Others argue the king and Thurzo feared that a full trial might expose politically sensitive connections. Elizabeth's arrest was already controversial. A public trial could have forced powerful families into scandal. By keeping her confined instead, the authorities avoided a spectacle, but also denied her any chance to defend herself. Elizabeth was sealed within a small room in Chachtas Castle. The windows were bricked over, leaving only slits for air and the passage of food. She could not leave, and no one could visit without permission. In this isolation, she spent the final years of her life, 4 long, silent winters. On the night of August 20th, 1614, Elizabeth complained to her guards that her hands were cold. The next morning, she was found dead. She was 54 years old. Her burial was met with resistance. Locals refused to have her interred in the village church, forcing her family to relocate her remains. Today, the exact location of her grave is unknown. In the centuries that followed, the legend of Elizabeth Bathory grew darker. Accounts of bathing in virgin's blood, of sadistic rituals, and of hundreds of victims became part of her myth. She was immortalized as Theblood Countess, one of history's most notorious female killers. Separating truth from myth is difficult. There is no question that young women died under her watch, but the scale, the motives, and the more sensational details may have been exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated by political enemies. Whether she was a mass murderer, a victim of a political conspiracy, or a complex mix of both, Elizabeth Bathory's story endures. It is a mirror reflecting the fears, power struggles, and cruelty of her age. 4 centuries later, her shadow still walks these halls.